Carson Blake was a man who lived by numbers. At 41, he had built empires from spreadsheets, turned struggling companies into billion-dollar giants, and earned a reputation that made boardrooms fall silent when he spoke. Control was his currency. His competitors folded under pressure. His contracts were ironclad, and women? They came and went like seasonal collections, admired but never truly seen. What he never allowed, however, was the thought of Black women. Not as colleagues he'd truly respect, not as partners, not as anything beyond background noise in his carefully curated world. It wasn't hatred, not the kind he'd admit to anyway. It was dismissal. Buried deep in the foundation of his privileged upbringing was a bias that whispered they weren't his caliber. They didn't fit his standard. They had no place in his universe. And so his existence continued in its calculated, predictable pattern until that evening. The terrace at the Sterling Tower was bathed in amber light. Hundreds of lanterns hung from iron frameworks, crystal sculptures caught the glow of candlelight, and a string ensemble filled the air with elegant harmonies. The skyline sprawled beyond like a masterpiece, tall buildings cutting through twilight with the bay shimmering below. It was Marcus Chen's 55th birthday, and Carson had attended more from obligation than enthusiasm. Marcus was a fellow Titan, an old connection from his Yale years, and his celebrations were always elaborate displays of influence. Guests drifted in designer suits and glittering evening wear, laughter punctuating the sound of champagne being poured. Carson stood near the railing, a glass of bourbon in hand, his sharp gray eyes observing the crowd with practiced indifference. He had already greeted a congressman, declined 3 pitches from startup founders, and survived a tedious exchange with an actress who seemed fascinated only by his helicopter. It was all familiar, expected, mundane until he noticed her. She arrived like an apparition. The first thing Carson registered was the dress, a flowing emerald silk that moved with her body like water, catching light with every step. Then came her bearing, graceful, assured, each movement suggesting she commanded whatever space she occupied. And finally, her presence. Refined features, glowing deep brown skin, and eyes that held both intelligence and quiet fire. Carson stilled. Something shifted within him. Something he couldn't name immediately. He wasn't a man who startled easily, but his pulse betrayed him, quickening with each second she moved deeper into the gathering. He instructed himself to turn away. Old programming murmured warnings. Not her. Not for you. But his gaze disobeyed. It followed her like a compass finding north. Who is that? Carson muttered to himself. No one nearby seemed to register her the way he did. Conversations flowed. Glasses clinked. The music continued. Yet for Carson, the entire event had dissolved into silence, leaving only her. She moved toward the bar, requested a drink with grace, and stood alone by the counter. Carson finished his bourbon, adjusted his suit jacket, and willed his legs forward. For the first time in a decade, he felt uncertain. "Good evening," he said when he finally stood beside her. His voice, typically authoritative and unwavering, carried a hint of hesitation. She turned toward him, her eyes scanning his face before her lips curved into a polite but measured smile. "Good evening." Up close, she was breathtaking. Her hair fell in natural waves over her shoulders, a pair of pearl earrings catching the light with each subtle movement. There was no hint of intimidation in her expression. If anything, she seemed to be assessing him, determining whether he merited her attention. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Carson said, offering his hand. "Carson Blake." Her eyebrow lifted slightly, as if placing the name. Still, she didn't react the way most people did when meeting him, no gushing or manufactured enthusiasm. Instead, she accepted his hand with quiet confidence. "Imani Foster," she replied. Imani. The name resonated through him like music. "Pleasure to meet you, Imani," Carson said, releasing her hand with reluctance. "Marcus certainly knows how to host." "He does," she agreed, glancing around the terrace. "Though I've never been drawn to all this extravagance. Too much shine makes it difficult to see substance." Carson blinked. No one spoke like that at these functions. Most attendees were too invested in maintaining appearances. Her observation was authentic, grounded. He found himself smiling, genuinely smiling. I couldn't agree more. These gatherings are theater. Her lips curved upward. And what character are you playing tonight, Mr. Blake? For a moment, Carson was caught off guard. No one addressed him like that, playful, almost daring. Women typically molded themselves to accommodate his ego. But not her. I suppose I'm playing the disinterested executive, he said with dry humor. And you? The witness, Imani replied smoothly, sipping her drink. I enjoy observing people perform. It reveals more about them than their rehearsed words ever do. He laughed softly, his fascination deepening. You're different from everyone here. And you're not as impressive as you think you are, she countered lightly. Carson laughed again. Actually laughed. A sound that surprised even him. What started as a cautious introduction evolved into a conversation that carried them through the night. They discussed philosophy, literature, global markets. She shared her passion for urban planning, how cities were shaped not merely by concrete and steel, but by the aspirations of their inhabitants. He found himself absorbed, genuinely engaged, not simply calculating his next response. And he astonished himself by revealing fragments of his reality he rarely acknowledged. The burden of his corporate kingdom, the isolation that accompanied achievement, the barriers he had constructed so tall even he struggled to scale them. With anyone else, he would have protected those truths like classified information. With her, the honesty emerged naturally. As the evening declined and guests began departing, Carson recognized something unsettling. He didn't want this exchange to conclude. I've enjoyed speaking with you, Imani, he said quietly, reluctant to rupture the moment. She smiled, her eyes warm but enigmatic. I've enjoyed it as well. He hesitated, then retrieved his phone. Would it be all right if I had your contact information? Perhaps we could continue this dialogue another time, somewhere less theatrical. There was a pause as she considered him. Carson felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest, as though awaiting judgment. Finally, she nodded and shared her number. When he saved it, something within him shifted. A threshold crossed. Later, as Carson sat in the back of his slate-gray Mercedes, the city lights streaming past the darkened windows, he stared at her name illuminated on a screen. Imani Foster. He should have been frustrated with himself. This wasn't characteristic. He didn't pursue women, didn't allow distractions, didn't lower his defenses, especially not for someone who embodied everything he once disregarded. And yet, he reclined against the leather seat, loosening his tie. For the first time in years, the future felt unpredictable. And strangely, he welcomed it. The executive, who had never once considered loving a black woman, had just spent the evening completely mesmerized by one. And he couldn't escape the certainty that his existence had fundamentally changed. Carson Blake wasn't easily captivated. He had encountered royalty, world leaders, technological innovators, and celebrated artists. Yet the morning following Marcus Chen's birthday celebration, as he sat in his corner office overlooking the harbor, his thoughts refused to release one name. Imani Foster. He had entered it into his contacts instinctively, but he hadn't stopped there. Curiosity pressed at him. Who was she authentically? A woman that composed, that insightful, that self-assured. She had to be more than just another attendee. His chief of staff, Natalie, knocked and entered, carrying the week's schedule. Carson was barely paying attention until Natalie casually mentioned, "Oh, and Jonathan Foster's daughter will be presenting at the Infrastructure Forum tomorrow. Should I prepare background materials?" Carson's attention snapped forward. Wait, Foster's daughter? Yes, Natalie said, surprised by his sudden focus. Imani Foster. She's the Chief Operations Officer of Foster Infrastructure. She oversees most of the company's development projects now, while her father handles strategic partnerships. Carson leaned back in his chair, a slow realization forming. Of course. Jonathan Foster was a legend, one of the few professionals in the industry Carson respected unconditionally. And Imani, his daughter, wasn't just elegant and intelligent. She was formidable, accomplished, a woman who forged her own legacy instead of existing in anyone's shadow. This wasn't simple attraction anymore. It was respect. The following afternoon, Carson arrived at the Infrastructure Forum. It was conducted at the Azure Conference Center, an expansive space of glass and innovation filled with the energy of the nation's most influential builders. Carson was accustomed to drawing attention wherever he appeared, but this time he found himself scanning the assembly for just one person. And then he found her. Imani stood near the demonstration models, her hair styled in professional curls, her charcoal blazer perfectly tailored. She radiated confidence. Every gesture measured, every word intentional. She wasn't just attending. She was commanding. Carson observed as a circle of junior professionals gathered around her, listening intently as she outlined a revolutionary approach to sustainable infrastructure for Foster's international projects. Her confidence was magnetic. He approached when the group dispersed. "Miss Foster," he greeted, this time with deliberate respect in his tone. Her lips formed a knowing smile. "Mr. Blake, twice in 1 week. People will begin to think you're tracking me." "Perhaps I am," he said smoothly. "Perhaps we simply travel in parallel circles and fortune is being generous." Imani chuckled softly, but her eyes narrowed with amusement. "You don't believe in fortune, Carson. You believe in strategy." That stopped him. She was correct. It was something he had revealed during their initial conversation. A rare glimpse beneath his armor. How had she retained it so effortlessly? "I'm starting to think you're far more perceptive than appearances suggest," Carson said. "And I'm starting to think you're not as invulnerable as you project," Imani replied. Over the weeks that followed, they began meeting more regularly. Initially, it operated under professional pretenses. Lunches where they analyzed development proposals, dinners where they debated economic forecasts, quiet hours in her office where she presented Foster Infrastructure's innovations in green construction. But somewhere between the blueprints and the projections, friendship developed. Carson found himself experiencing more joy with Imani than he had with anyone in years. She challenged him without fear, questioned his assumptions, and occasionally declined his invitations just to remind him he wasn't the center of her world. He admired her dedication, her precision, her refusal to rely on her father's reputation. And she, in turn, respected his vision, his relentless determination, and the rare moments of authenticity he permitted her to witness. For the first time, Carson felt like he wasn't simply valued for his wealth or influence, he was understood. But the world surrounding them wasn't as accepting. At a private dinner one evening, Carson's longtime business associate, Gregory Ashford, leaned forward with a smirk. "I hear you've been spending considerable time with Jonathan Foster's daughter." Carson remained composed. And, Gregory continued, swirling his wine. "Surely you recognize what people are discussing. A man of your standing with, well, a woman like her. It doesn't align with expectations." Carson's expression hardened. "And what expectations are those?" "You understand what I mean," Gregory said dismissively. "Society has standards. Investors have standards. Don't complicate matters by confusing personal with." "That's enough." Carson's voice cut like ice. Gregory retreated, startled by the intensity in his expression. But Carson was finished listening. That night, as he drove home, anger churned within him, not at Imani, but at himself. Because deep down, he understood that Gregory was merely articulating what Carson himself had once believed. The prejudice he thought buried was still present, ready to inject doubt. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks later. They were attending a foundation gala, another polished event filled with practiced smiles and calculated whispers. Carson escorted Imani inside, their entrance attracting stares. She looked stunning in a midnight blue gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm. For most of the evening, everything was perfect until a society figure, emboldened by alcohol and arrogance, spoke loud enough for Carson to hear. "Is he serious? Carson Blake parading around with her? Must be some kind of experiment. He'll return to normal soon enough." The words cut through the atmosphere. Carson froze mid-stride. Imani, sensing the shift, squeezed his arm gently, her eyes urging restraint. But he couldn't. He turned, his voice slicing through the hall like steel. If you have something to express about the woman I'm with, then address me directly. Otherwise, keep your prejudice to yourself. The room fell silent. All eyes turned. The socialite stammered, face flushing before retreating hastily. Carson surveyed the room, challenging anyone else to speak. No one did. When he turned back to Imani, her eyes were wide, not with alarm, but with something deeper, something warmer. "Why did you do that?" she whispered once they were alone on the balcony. "Because you deserve respect," he said simply. "And because I refuse to stand idle while anyone diminishes who you are." Imani's expression softened. For the first time, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing his jaw. "You're evolving, Carson Blake. And I don't know whether to be amazed or concerned." He caught her hand gently, holding it against his cheek. "Be both." From that night forward, their connection intensified. They spent weekends exploring museums, debating which exhibits captured genuine brilliance. They escaped the city for extended, peaceful dinners where anonymity was possible. Carson began sharing his childhood, the austere household, the expectations that suffocated him, the loneliness wealth never eliminated. And Imani revealed her own struggles, the pressure of living in her father's legacy, the constant need to prove she wasn't merely his daughter, but her own force. The subtle discrimination she faced in boardrooms where her expertise was questioned until she proved it undeniably. They discovered refuge in each other. They discovered comprehension. And slowly, Carson realized something profound. The walls he had spent years constructing were dissolving, one by one, under the steady warmth of her presence. By the end of the season, there was no denying it anymore. They weren't just associates. They weren't just companions. They were something more. Carson knew at the moment he kissed her for the first time. A quiet evening after a lengthy meeting. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't strategic. He simply looked at her, saw the way her eyes softened when she smiled, and leaned in. And when she didn't withdraw, when she kissed him back with a tenderness that felt both powerful and gentle, he knew his world had shifted permanently. The executive who once swore he'd never regard a black woman with anything beyond indifference was falling fast. And for the first time in his existence, he wasn't afraid of the descent. Love wasn't something Carson Blake had ever relied upon. He had witnessed it weaponized as leverage, employed as camouflage, exploited as vulnerability. In his realm of billion-dollar transactions and merciless strategy, love was a mirage, appealing, hazardous, and temporary. But with Imani Foster, it wasn't a mirage. It was undeniable, tangible, and frightening in its magnitude. What began as companionship had blossomed into something profound. Their borrowed evenings transformed into entire weekends together. Their meetings, once restricted to professional contexts, became journeys of mutual discovery. Carson found himself absorbing the patterns of her existence. The way she hummed quietly when focused. The way she consistently chose herbal tea over coffee. The way her laughter, uninhibited and authentic, resonated long after it subsided. Imani, in turn, witnessed a Carson no one else had encountered. She saw the man beneath the empire, the boy who once sought his father's validation and never received it, the man who craved silence after days of commanding power. She saw his imperfections, his stubbornness, his occasional temper, his sporadic arrogance, but she also witnessed his gentleness. The quiet way he reached for her hand when no one was observing. They were falling deeply, irrevocably in love. But love, especially love that shattered barriers, never arrived without opposition. The media responded swiftly. Carson Blake, elusive, untouchable bachelor, was suddenly appearing at galas with Imani Foster on his arm. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, gossip publications speculated. Blake's new romance, Foster heiress or business strategy? Society stunned as Carson Blake dates against type. Power couple or public relations move? Some celebrated them. Many didn't. And then there was his history. One cool autumn evening, Carson encountered Vivian Cross, his former partner. Tall, blonde, and striking, Vivian had always embodied the kind of woman society expected him to choose. They met at a charity auction, and Vivian wasted no time approaching. "Carson," she purred, her crimson lips forming a practiced smile. "Imagine my surprise seeing you with her."
His jaw tightened.
"What do you want, Vivian?" "Just to remind you," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "that people like us belong together. Do you honestly believe your board, your investors, even your social circle will respect you with someone like Imani?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Dangerous. If you ever speak her name with that tone again, there will be consequences. Am I clear?" Vivian faltered, her confidence cracking beneath the cold fire in his eyes. But the damage was inflicted. Carson couldn't shake the fury, not at her, but at himself. Because once, he would have agreed with her. That night, as he sat in Imani's apartment, he confessed the truth. "There was a time," he said quietly, staring at the floor, "when I would have overlooked you. Not because of who you are, but because of your race. I would have convinced myself we were incompatible, that it could never succeed." Imani remained silent, her eyes searching his face. "And now?" she asked finally. He met her gaze, his voice steady. "Now I know I was ignorant. Because you are everything I didn't realize I needed. You're strong, brilliant, beautiful, and I dismantle everything before I'd let anyone separate us." For a long moment, she simply observed him. Then she crossed the room, cupped his face in her hands, and whispered, "Don't dismantle everything, Carson. Just promise me you'll stand beside me through it." And he promised. Their relationship became whispered legend. They traveled together, not merely to exclusive resorts and private estates, but to places with meaning. They visited community centers Imani supported, schools her foundation funded. Carson, who had once donated without caring about impact, began witnessing the power of compassion through her eyes. They shared intimate nights cooking in her modest kitchen, where Carson, hopeless at preparing vegetables, ended up overcooking the pasta while Imani laughed until tears formed. They took extended drives through wine country, where silence felt as natural as conversation. And through it all, Carson transformed. Not weakly, not passively, but with a strength that emerged from knowing he didn't have to face existence alone. Still, the challenges continued. An article surfaced, accusing Imani of pursuing Carson for his wealth. Another portrayed Carson as a man experimenting with novelty, destined to move on. The scrutiny was relentless. One night, after a particularly malicious article, Imani sat on her balcony, her arms wrapped around herself. "Maybe this was a mistake," she whispered. "Maybe the world will never see us for who we truly are." Carson knelt before her, his hands on her knees, his eyes fierce. "I don't care what the world sees. I see you. That's sufficient for me." "But is it sufficient for us?" she asked softly. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he kissed her with an intensity that conveyed everything she needed to understand. The turning point arrived when Carson chose to make a public declaration. At a major business summit, during a press conference, a journalist asked bluntly, "Mr. Blake, what do you say to critics who claim your relationship with Miss Foster is inappropriate?" The room went silent. Cameras focused. Carson looked directly into the lens and said, "The only inappropriate thing I ever did was not recognizing her value sooner. Imani Foster is not just my partner. She's a leader, a visionary, and the woman I love. If anyone has concerns about that, they can address them with me personally." The applause that followed was deafening. And though controversy didn't disappear overnight, the statement established a boundary. Carson Blake had chosen his position, and it was with Imani. It was months later, on a peaceful evening, that Carson decided he couldn't delay any longer. They were at her favorite location by the harbor, the city lights reflecting on the water. Imani leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, content. Carson reached into his pocket, his heart pounding in a way it never had in negotiations or confrontations. Imani, he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. She looked up at him, curiosity in her eyes. I spent my existence believing love was weakness, that allowing someone close would cost me everything. But then you arrived, and you demonstrated that love isn't weakness. It's the most powerful thing I've ever experienced. I don't want to face a single day without you beside me. He produced the velvet box, opening it to reveal a diamond ring that sparkled like the stars above. Will you marry me? For once, Imani Foster, eloquent, unshakable Imani, was speechless. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, yes. 1,000 times yes. Their wedding was magnificent but personal, a paradox only they could achieve. The venue was filled with orchids and gardenias, the seating lined with family, friends, and leaders from across the globe. Carson stood at the altar in a tailored midnight tuxedo, his heart racing as the doors opened. And there she was, Imani, radiant in ivory lace and silk, walking toward him like a vision. The entire world seemed to disappear, leaving only her. When she reached him, Carson took her hands, his voice steady as he spoke his vows. I once existed in a world of barriers, constructed from pride and prejudice. But you dismantled them with nothing more than your grace, your strength, and your love. From this moment forward, I am yours completely, unconditionally, eternally. Imani's voice trembled as she replied. You once feared love, Carson. But you gave me yours, and I'll spend my life proving you were right to trust it. I choose you today, tomorrow, and always. When they kissed, the venue erupted in applause. As they danced that night beneath a canopy of stars, Carson understood the truth. He hadn't just discovered love, he had found redemption. The executive who once dismissed Black women had fallen irreversibly in love with one. And in loving her, he had discovered not only his heart, but his humanity. For Carson and Imani, love had not just conquered prejudice, it had conquered everything. And it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together with love.